I'm done with the spring portion of the trailer fix-up. If I was just going to put it back the way it was, I could just put those axles back underneath there. But I'm going to put those axles underneath the springs to try to gain a little bit of height on that trailer. So the next part of the project will be to, I'm going to take these axles over into the hangar because it's been so wet out here. It's supposed to be fairly decent for a few days, but it's going to get down freezing pretty hard, so I can put those over in the hangar there and clean them up. There's a little bit of modification to do on them. Right there, just inside of the brake disc on the axle is a pad, and that pad normally rests on the axle, on the spring. You can see it has a little hole in it where it fits on that bolt there that goes through the spring to hold the springs together. There's a kit to undersling those axles that comes with a new pad that you have to put on, so I can put it on and weld it onto the axle. So I need to take the wire brush and clean all the rust and stuff off those axles real good before I do that. So that's the next project, is to fix those axles up to get them so we can mount them underneath the springs there. Well, I brought the axles over here yesterday and set them up on my horses in here inside the hangar where I could get to them out of the weather. And of course, now the weather dried off, it's nice and sunny outside, but I don't feel like picking those things up and horsing them around by myself anymore, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave them in here. I'm going to start with the wire brush on them, then I'll flip them over and clean the top side of them up. Well, I want to clean the whole length of them up because they're getting pitted and rusty there. I'll go ahead and, as long as I got them off there, I'll go ahead and clean them up and put some Exo Rust on them. And then I clean up around those spring pads and put the new spring pads on. They go on the opposite side. And one of the little problems I'm going to have there is that those wires for the brakes feed through the axle, and they come right out there where the, I'm going to focus on, there it goes, they come out right there where the spring hangers are, where that one's going to be on there and welded on. So I think I'll hook some safety wire on those and shove them in the axle, and we'll clean up around there and get some fresh paint on it and stuff, and when I get done, then I'll pull the wires back out. I got the bottom side of those axles wire brushed clean. This one on this side, I hooked the wire that goes through it for the brake and wound up pulling it all the way out. It wound up on the wire brush, so I didn't do a very good job getting it out of the way. Well, I got some help and I turned those axles over, and they're a pain in the butt because the axles are offset. They're drop axles, and they're offset so that they're not balanced. You can't just roll them around like you could a regular set of axles. So anyway, I got some help getting them tipped up, and then we took the welder and just put a bead, just put a spot weld there on that pad. That's the spring pad. I just spot welded it to my sawhorses there so that they won't flop around, they won't tip over. And I'll go ahead and wire brush this side of it, get it all cleaned up, and get it ready to put the new spring pads on. I've got the axles all cleaned up with the wire brush, and I worked real hard here around it where this saddle's going to go. This is the saddle, or the spring pad, whichever you want to call it. Saddle where it fits over that axle, and spring pad because the spring fits on it here. It's got a couple of bolts welded on it on the underside, and then they want you to use these coupling nuts on there to adjust that, so you can adjust it to where it's parallel with this spring pad that's already on there. So you want this face of this pad to be parallel with this face of this pad. I thought I had it pretty well figured out that it could just butt up against this weld here. There's a weld right here where this axle, part of the axle from the wheel, is welded into the pipe axle that goes across there. And I thought I could, from looking at these other pads, that just butted up against it. But this new pad here is a little bit wider than the original. And to get it in the same plane as that one puts it right on that weld which cants it up at kind of an angle. So I'm gonna have to take the grinder and grind that weld down a little bit. Also here, we got to noticing that where these U-bolts went on around that axle, there's pretty good wear in some of these. Pretty good groove in there, worn in from that U-bolt. So I'll probably take the welder and build up that a little bit where that wear is on the axle. So yeah, got all those welds ground down to the point where I can get those saddles mounted on there, fitted on there right, without all being jacked out of shape. Well, the wires go through the axle for the brakes. So they come down one frame on one side of the trailer and hook up onto one side, and then there's a double wire that goes through the axle and comes out on the opposite wheel. There were holes put in the axle there that the brakes were routed through. But after I put the spring pads on, I could see they were going to be a problem. They're right there in the way. Now, if those bolts weren't on there for adjusting those spring pads parallel, probably would have been okay. With them right there behind those bolts, that's pretty tough to deal with there. I think I'm going to weld up those holes, just cover them up. There's several ways of measuring these. I could just get a rule and measure them, but I got these calipers here, and if I just set those on both sides, I can get them pretty darn close like that. See, that gets that pretty close there. Well, then I can just tack that on there now, and then get them all set up and tacked on, and then come back and weld them on. I filled all those holes that the wires went through there, and I went ahead and ground them down because the beads did stick out a little ways, and with these bolts here on these pads, they might have interfered with them a little bit. I've got all the pads set up in place. Now these new pads are just a little bit wider than the old ones, and the bolt going down there, if you center that, eyeball that centered on that lower pad, that's pretty close. You got almost equal amount of pad hanging over each side of the bottom one. Oh, that's probably close enough. So I'll go ahead and take my calipers and set each one of those up so that they're parallel. The faces are parallel, and then I'll tack them down, and then I'll come back and weld them up. I've got all four of these tacked down. Like I said, I eyeballed them, the center lines here, so they're just by eyeball. There was about the same amount of overhang on each side of these spring hangers or spring pads. Put the bolts just about center with the lower ones. And I took these calipers and adjusted them and set them up equal on both sides. This is not precision machine work by any stretch of the imagination. Every one of these is slightly different size than the other one. I had to adjust the calipers for each one of these slightly different. So close is good enough, but that should be pretty damn close in getting those things parallel, this pad parallel with that one. It's going to be kind of a challenge getting in and welding the back side of these because they're awful close to where this axle goes up here, but we'll get in and get it done. So I'll go ahead and get these all welded on, and they don't have to be bridge welded on there. All the weight and stress, pretty much the springs, the weight of the trailer is going to be down on these axles. So and it looks like these grooves that I saw that were worn in here from the U-bolts, looks like these pads, these saddles here, pretty much fit in those grooves. So this weld is going to fill that up pretty good, and so I'm not going to have to do any extra welding in those grooves where the wear was on the U-bolts. Well, I'll get those welded up now, and well, I got one bead, one side welded on each one of these pads. Well, I think this is going to work. I found some 1/4 inch steel fuel line or brake line, something I was using to probably make brake lines or something on one of my trucks. Anyway, I'm stretching it out across there, and I turned the welder down, took the heat selector down. I might turn it down just a little bit more and the wire speed down, and it on low power setting. Anyway, and I just running a bead on there every few inches. Start the bead, do the primary weld and put it real good into this axle tube, and then just touch this pipe, this steel tubing a little bit, because it's pretty easy to burn through that. Only need really one line going across there. I can put a ground in the frame on the other side, and then I can run a splice between one of the leads on the brake on the front axle back to the rear axle, and then, well, actually I splice both wires together and just put them right into the frame for a ground, and that'll work fine. And I don't need to run all those wires that way. So I'll just keep going here and tacking this down a little bit at a time. It looks like it's going to work. Got a coat of primer on the top side of the axles. I'll let them sit here overnight, but they should dry a little better than the trailer frame did, because I've got radiant heaters shining down on them, some electric radiant heaters shining down on them, so even though the breeze blows in here a little bit, they still get a little bit of heat on them. Let them dry overnight, and then I'll take the grinder and grind out those spot welds where they're welded onto those sawhorses. Let them roll over to the other side and get the other side primered, and then I'll have to think about whether I'm going to put paint on them or not, but they look better with primer on them, all sanded up anyway. So I managed to get the axles out here and put underneath the trailer. Just brought them out on the Bobcat and the forks and set them down, and then worked them around under there. Of course, some of the paint got scrubbed off, but not all of it. I jacked the trailer up with the jacks to get the axles underneath there, and then once I got them underneath, then I lowered it back down so we don't have to raise them up so far to get them set on the springs. So now we'll pull those axles up and get them lined on the springs. I'll probably do that other side first and then come over and do this side. So we'll just put some blocks underneath it, raise it up, put some blocks under, and just keep raising it up until we get it lined up with that axle on that side, and or that spring on that side. And then we'll come over and do this one. I'm doing this on the dirt, so I picked this end up and put it on a couple of pieces of plywood, and that way the other end, and I put that big rope underneath it and used it to pick the ends up and would walk them around and just set them down in the dirt. But this end was pivoting, so I didn't want to leave it in the dirt because it'd fill up that brake drum with gravel and crap. Now I got this one lined up with the hole in the spring. This is the rear one, and I've got it lined up with the hole in the spring. I just picked it up with the rope and stick that 4x underneath it, and then was able to move it around back and forth, sliding on that other piece of 2x4 until I got it lined up with this bolt that runs through and holds the spring up. And then by maneuvering the spring around through this equalizer, I was able to get everything lined up so it fit on there. I put this plate on, and at first I thought the plate wasn't going to work. It was too wide and running into this axle here. Then I realized I had the plate on the wrong way. It goes long ways instead of crossways, so that works better. So I'll tighten these bolts up a little bit. Now, these bolts are, one end of them is kind of compressed so that it's a locking bolt. So you got to watch which end you start on there. Otherwise it's hard to get it started and threaded on very far. If you turn it around the side that's not the locking side, then it'll thread on pretty good till it gets down to where it gets in that compressed portion of the bolt, or the nut. So I'll tighten that one up just a little bit. I want to leave it loose enough that I can work it, but I don't want it coming off out of alignment with that spring. And then I can maneuver the other one around using some levers and some blocks until I get it to where I want it. '64, '66, 66 is a good number. That's a pretty wide range. I'll go on the higher end of the range here, just because. Set those up. The axle's all back in there, all tied up, and I jacked the trailer up high enough to get the wheels, the tires and wheels back on. So that's set up for that. I can put those on. And the next thing to do is to wire up the brakes. Well, I stopped working on the trailer for a few days. The weather got kind of sour. It was raining, windy. I think we got 4 or 5 inches of rain the last week and a half or so. It was blowing 30, 40, 50 miles an hour for a few days. So anyway, I didn't get anything done with the trailer for a few days, which was fine. We worked on the cistern up there. We've been building a cover for it. We've got a 10,000 gallon tank up there beside the house, and we put a cover, or built a cover for it. So we drained the cistern and then washed the inside of it all out and got it all cleaned out, and then put the cover on. And the rain has got it to about a little over a third full, and we've probably got about 3,000-4,000 gallons in there now from the last couple weeks of rain. Anyway, I didn't get much done on the trailer during that period of time. Before I quit on the trailer, I was working on wiring the brakes up, and what I had found was where this wire come through this hole in the frame right here. I'd shoved it up in there to keep it from getting damaged, the insulation damaged or anything when I wire brushed this frame, but I wound up getting part of the insulation scraped off of it back a ways anyway. And when I went to pull it out, then I found that the insulation had burned here where I welded up on those spring hangers. So I had to feed a new wire in there. Well, they run this wire inside of this, this is not channel, this is tube, the box tube or rectangular tube. They run the wire through the tube, which is fine. It helps protect the wire quite a bit, keeps it from hanging out and getting drug on things when you're driving. But it makes it kind of tough to feed new wire in there. And because I was worried about, because I found burn spots on the wire where these two spring hangers were, where I welded on them, I was afraid that maybe the wires going back to for the tail lights had gotten burned too. So I went ahead and come up here to this junction up here where they connect into the main cable that comes from the truck, the plug-in for that. I went ahead and cut those wires there, tied a string on them. Now this is a bundle. They use 3 wires in a bundle here. They're all kind of glued together, and so you got one is your tail lights, one is your brake light, and one is a turn signal, or you've got turn signal for each light, left and right. So anyway, I went ahead and tied a string onto those and pulled them out through the other end. And when I got it out and inspected it, the wire was just fine, so I didn't need to pull a new wire through there. But I used these wires, this wire here, to pull the wire for the new wire for the brake cable. And at the same time, I pulled another wire through so that I can hook up a reverse light back there. This trailer is kind of a pain in the butt to back up in the dark. So I've got some LED lights I want to hook up for reverse lights. So that's where we are right now with the trailer project. So I can go ahead and splice this brake wire. This is the lead for the brake line here, and I'll go ahead and splice that into these brakes. I'll run one line here, run another line back for that rear brake, and then I run this line through the tube across that axle, and I'll go ahead and hook it up on that side. I'll splice it into that brake and then run another wire back to that rear axle back there and splice it into it. The ground wire will bring up and just run it into a ground on that frame on that side. Well, about the time I got my tools and stuff out yesterday to start working on this wiring, it started raining. So I wound up quitting, taking the dogs for a walk, and sitting out the rain. Today, it rained a little bit this morning, but it wasn't too bad. I probably should have been out here working on this instead of sitting in there reading the computer on the news and see what was going on in the world. Well, anyway, I came out and started working on this. And I got this side wired up. I got my positive wire, my lead, brake lead coming down and spliced into the front brake. And I also have it spliced into this line that's going to go across this axle here over to the other side. And I went ahead and I was just going to splice in a line to go from here up this frame and maybe put a couple of cable clamps on it to go back to that rear brake. But I decided to go ahead and fish that through that frame rail. So I got a piece of wire and run through from that hole back there on that above that rear axle up to this one, and then fished a piece of wire through there to use to run the brake power back to this one. So this one's a little simpler. We just have the brake line, power for the brake coming to it, and the line coming up for ground. Well, I'm still going to have to fix the grounds on these, and you can see the old bolt right here, the old screw that went in there for the ground. I can't get a wrench to fit on those, but I'll get a new one, or get that out of there and put a new one in. And I have to see whether I'm going to put. I might put a. That's not too bad. I was thinking about putting a cable clamp on there for that to hold this cable up. Now I got some heat shrink tubing and run these two cables through that to help support them and to help from abrading where it comes out of this hole here. And I think I had a piece of gas hose that I cut to stick in there for a grommet before. I think I'll probably do the same thing again for this, just to keep that from abrading. And then I use these. This is a number 10, 8 to 10 splice here with heat shrink on it. I use that on this. It's only 14 gauge wire, actually 16 gauge wire going into the brake hub itself. But I use this because I've got two wires going into it. So I crimp those down. I like using these ones with the heat shrink on them, as you heat shrink those down, it adds a strain relief onto that, a little bit more support to the wire, so it's not all supported by the crimp in there, and helps keep them from getting pulled out if there's a tug on them or something. But the ones I really like are these marine style ones with adhesive in them. And we heat those up, the adhesive melts, and it does two things. One, it glues itself to the wire, but the glue fills in any gaps in the wire in there and seals it up, makes it pretty much watertight. And you can see that, I don't know whether you can see it or not, but it's coming out of this single one here for the ground, but it's in there on that double one too. And I put some more heat shrink on here for strain relief on that and to kind of hold the wires in tight. And down here on this, where this wire goes through the axle tube, or the tube I put on the axle, I put some thin heat shrink. This is just some cheap stuff I got from Harbor Freight, I believe. I just put a length of that over there and heated it up, and so it could go in through this tube and add a little bit of anti-chafe just to double up the insulation on that tube. I might put some RTV in there just to add a little bit more strain relief on there to keep that wire from rubbing and abrading on that. I did the same thing on the other side where it comes out of the tube on that other side. I think what I'm going to do before I go any farther on the other side is I'm going to get a drill and go ahead and drill a hole in that frame rail on that other side. So I was just going to run the cable up on that outside or the inside section of that frame rail with cable clamps. But I think I'm going to go ahead and drill that frame rail and run the wire through the frame rail like I did on this side. just gets one more spot, kind of cleans it up a little better and makes one more spot where there's no cable to hang up on anything. It's starting to rain again now. We're supposed to have a big storm come in for a few days. More heavy rain, 30, 40, 50 mile an hour winds, so I don't know how much I'm going to get done. Now I was hoping to get the wheels on this thing, but it's starting to get dark already. It's about time to go take the dogs for their evening run. Well, I didn't think I was going to be able to get anything done today. The forecast was for heavy rain and strong winds, and the forecast didn't disappoint. It probably rained about an inch overnight since yesterday evening. I guess it started raining early this morning, and the wind blew here pretty good, 30, 40 miles an hour. But about 1 o'clock or so, the rain let up. The wind's kind of let up too a little bit. It's still blowing. Still getting a few gusts here, and if I get out away from here where it's sheltered, it's probably blowing pretty good, but not like it was. So I was able to get out here and work on the trailer a little bit more. I got the brakes all hooked up here. Got some vice grips and tried to get these screws out of here that were for the ground on here before, and it just broke the head off of that one, and this one I couldn't get it to budge, so I just left it in there. And I tapped a hole in the frame here for a 832 screw, and I just got a stainless steel 832 screw out of my airplane kit and bonded it to the frame there. And this is the ground wire. Anyway, the brakes are all wired up now, so I can put the wheels on there and get this thing ready to go. And the only thing I have left to do is splice these wires back into the wiring harness where it comes out here from the pigtail for the plug for the trailer lights. And then I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do with this wire I ran for the backup light here, if I'm going to put that on. But I don't need that on there to get the trailer running. All we need is just to get the lights hooked up and get the brakes working and the lights working and the wheels on there, and we'll be ready to go. It's been a couple days since the last time I worked on the trailer. We had some pretty good weather here. Probably got 2 or 3 inches of rain last couple of days. Had 30, 40 mile an hour winds. Got a little break in it today, so I'll get back out here and work on it again a little bit. I went ahead and put some tie wraps on that wire bundle, kind of tighten it up a little bit, and same thing back here on this front wheel on the left side where all the wiring comes together. I kind of got a little bit extra wire there, so I went ahead and bundled that up, put a tie wrap on it, and got it cleaner. We'll see how that goes with that wire going across there on that axle. I'm going to go ahead and put the wheels on. I've got this front left wheel started, got it up on there and the bolts on. Okay. So I don't like picking these tires up anymore to set them on the bolts like I used to. I can't do it like I used to, it hurts too much. So I just use a shovel to stick underneath there to get those lined up on there until I get them lined up and get them on. And I'll go ahead and start some of the nuts on here, get them all the way around, then I'll get the air wrench and tighten them up. Well, I got the tires and wheels on. That thing sits significantly higher than it did. It's going to come down a little bit as those shackles on that springs reverse themselves. They're still down, hanging down, and once they get to working and get a load on it and stuff, they'll reverse themselves and come up. That'll drop that down a little bit, but that's a lot higher than it was. That's going to make a little bit of problem with loading and unloading it potentially. May have to get longer ramps or something. We'll see how that works once we get her back going. So everything is done on there now, except I still have to clean out those grommets for the lights. I want to clean those out so I can get the lights back in those grommets. Got the wheels on, so get those lights back in it and I'll be ready to take it out for a test spin.